The rumbling began before sunrise, deep and unbroken, like far-off thunder that refused to fade. In the market town of Weymouth, Dorset Mary Richards, 42 years old, drew back her blackout curtain and stared in disbelief. What she saw looked like the entire American army pouring down the high street. Trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, tanks, an endless stream of olive-drab metal, and men that would continue rolling for 3 days without pause. "My God," she murmured, barely audible. "There are thousands of them." She wasn't wrong. By early 1944, around 1.5 million American servicemen had arrived in Britain. Almost overnight, they were everywhere. In pubs and cinemas, leaning on street corners, flooding railway stations, turning quiet market towns into places that felt more like Texas than southern England. For British civilians who had endured 4 long years of rationing, air raids, and relentless hardship, the arrival of the Americans felt like someone had cracked open a door to another world, a noisier world, a richer one, a world that chewed gum, spoke with movie accents, and seemed untouched by the kind of exhaustion Britain carried in its bones. What people said about the Americans, and what they truly felt, was far from simple. The buildup had begun back in 1942 with Operation Bolero, the vast and carefully planned transfer of American forces across the Atlantic. But it wasn't until late 1943 and the opening months of 1944 that their presence became overwhelming, impossible to ignore. Southern England turned into one enormous military camp. Devon, Dorset, Hampshire, Cornwall, East Anglia, everywhere you looked, Americans. The British government tried, at least on paper, to prepare both sides. American troops arriving in Britain were issued a booklet titled A Short Guide to Great Britain. It warned them that the British were reserved, that they had been fighting alone for years, that tea mattered deeply, that British beer was served warm, and that boasting or showing off was frowned upon. The British, on the other hand, received no booklet at all. They simply received the Americans, ready or not. "They're so tall," became one of the first remarks heard everywhere. Better nutrition, different genetics. Whatever the reason, American soldiers seemed to loom over their British counterparts. And they looked cleaner, women noticed. Their uniforms were newer and better fitted, boots polished, gear plentiful. Everything about them suggested abundance, more money, more confidence, more of everything. But it was when they started talking that the real culture shock hit. "Hiya, sweetheart," American soldiers would call out. Not a careful "good morning, miss," or a polite nod, just immediate, casual friendliness that felt charming to some and shockingly forward to others. Everyone was buddy or pal. They walked with hands in their pockets, slouched easily, chewing gum constantly, jaws working as if they never stopped. In pubs they were loud, laughing, clapping backs, filling entire rooms with their voices. They seemed to take up twice the space a British soldier ever would. Before long, a phrase spread across Britain, half joke and half complaint. "The trouble with the Yanks is they're overpaid, oversexed, and over here." It stuck because to many it rang true. An American private earned roughly $50 a month, around £12. A British private earned about £2 a week, barely £10 a month. Americans had more than 5 times the spending power, and it showed everywhere. They bought rounds of drinks without hesitation. They took women out to restaurants British soldiers couldn't dream of affording. They had chocolate, cigarettes, nylon stockings that had vanished from British shops years earlier. The Americans, naturally, had a joke of their own. British are underpaid, undersexed, and under Eisenhower. But beneath the laughter, real tension simmered. In the pubs of Southampton and Portsmouth, British soldiers home on leave watched American GIs buy drinks for British women, and resentment flared almost instantly. These were men who had been fighting since 1939, men who had survived Dunkirk, North Africa, and the deadly Atlantic convoys, only to return home and find their girlfriends dancing with confident Americans who had arrived fresh, wealthy, and full of swagger. Arguments were inevitable. Fights broke out. Before long, military police from both nations were ordered to patrol together, trying to keep tempers from boiling over. "They treat our women like they're goods for sale," one British corporal told a mass observation interviewer in early 1944. The Mass Observation Project, a British social research organization, had been collecting diaries and conducting surveys since before the war. It captured what people said privately, away from official speeches and patriotic headlines, and what emerged was complicated. Yes, there was resentment. Yes, there were cultural clashes, bruised egos, and misunderstandings that sometimes turned violent. But there was also something else, something softer, especially in the words of women and children. "They're incredibly generous," a shopkeeper in Dorchester wrote, "almost to an embarrassing degree. An American soldier will buy sweets for every child in the shop, handing them out like Father Christmas." British soldiers couldn't do that. They simply didn't have the money. Children noticed immediately. Within weeks of the Americans' arrival, British children had learned the magic phrase, "Got any gum, chum?" They followed American soldiers down the street, a small procession of hopeful faces. The Americans, many of them barely older than the children themselves, rarely said no. Wrigley's spearmint gum, Hershey chocolate bars, candy British children hadn't seen in years. To British eyes, the Americans seemed to have an endless supply. "My daughter came home with chocolate 3 times last week," a mother in Plymouth recorded in her diary. "She's never had so many sweets in her life. I should probably stop her begging, but when was the last time we had chocolate?" To the Americans, it was nothing. They had access to PX stores, private military shops stocked with goods that British civilians could barely imagine anymore. Cigarettes by the carton, chocolate by the pound, coffee, canned food, soap, razor blades, items Britain had been doing without for years. This created an economy of its own. British women who dated Americans suddenly had stockings again. Lipstick, perfume, luxuries long absent from daily life. Some relationships remained innocent. Others were more transactional, driven by scarcity and survival. The term "good time girls" entered public conversation. Local authorities worried about morality and rising venereal disease rates, yet many of the relationships were real. By the end of the war, roughly 70,000 British women would marry American servicemen. They became GI brides, crossing the Atlantic after the war to begin new lives in the United States. Families reacted in sharply different ways. "My father won't speak to me," a young woman from Devon wrote to her sister. "He says I'm abandoning England for a Yank, who'll probably forget me once he gets home." "But Jim isn't like that," she continued. "He's from Iowa. He wants me to meet his mother. Father just can't see past the uniform." Other families welcomed the Americans warmly, inviting them for tea, Sunday dinner, or Christmas meals, trying to ease the homesickness of young men far from home. In small villages across southern England, American soldiers became temporary members of British households. They wrote home about strange food, endless cups of tea, and unexpected kindness, about warm beer and warmer people. But cultural confusion flowed both ways. British civilians found Americans baffling. Why did they put ice in every drink? Why did they talk so much? Why didn't they understand queuing? Why did they push to the front? And why complain about British beer being warm when that was exactly how beer was meant to be served? One issue, however, proved far more troubling than complaints about noise or manners: the question of race. British civilians found this aspect of the American presence deeply confusing and at times disturbing. The U.S. Army was segregated. Black soldiers served in separate units, ate in separate mess halls, and were often assigned support duties rather than frontline combat roles. When these units arrived in Britain, American commanders expected British society to follow the same rules. They asked pub owners to designate certain nights for white soldiers and different nights for black soldiers. They requested separate seating areas. In some towns, American military police attempted to enforce segregation themselves. Many British civilians refused. Britain was not free of racial prejudice, but formal segregation was not part of British social life. For many pub owners, the idea of turning away any man fighting Hitler was unthinkable. Several told American officers bluntly that everyone was welcome in their establishment, regardless of skin color. When white American MPs tried to remove black soldiers from British pubs, locals sometimes stepped in. I saw 3 American MPs dragging a colored soldier out of a pub in Bamber Bridge, a Lancashire man recorded in his diary. The publican came out shouting that the lad had done nothing wrong, that he was welcome. People gathered. It turned nasty. The Americans, he wrote, did not understand that we don't do things their way here. In June 1943, tensions in Bamber Bridge escalated into violence. A confrontation turned into a shooting. 1 black American soldier was killed, several others wounded. The incident shocked British civilians, who struggled to understand how such bloodshed could erupt over something that seemed so plainly unjust. These were the complications of hosting an army of 1.5 million foreign troops. Daily life became a series of small frictions, awkward moments, cultural collisions, misunderstandings that had to be endured and navigated. In East Anglia, where the American 8th Air Force built its bomber bases, entire villages found themselves living beside vast airfields. The roar of B-17 and B-24 bombers taking off before dawn became the soundtrack of everyday life. Villagers would watch the aircraft lift into the sky in long formations, then wait anxiously in the afternoon, counting them as they returned. They noticed the gaps. "You learn not to get too close," a woman from Suffolk wrote. "You see the same faces in the pub for weeks, then suddenly they're gone. You know what that means. You see it in the others' faces. Someone didn't come back." The Americans brought their culture with them. Glenn Miller and his Army Air Forces band toured Britain playing to packed halls. American films filled local cinemas. Dances were organized wherever space allowed, often with 5 British women for every American soldier. Rotation systems were introduced, limiting how long each couple could dance. British girls learned to jitterbug, a fast, energetic style that looked wild, almost scandalous to older generations. "They throw the girls around like dolls," one disapproving father muttered. "All this American jazz and carrying on. It's not decent." But the girls loved it. After years of darkness, bombing, and constant worry, the Americans brought energy and excitement. They carried themselves with a confidence British men no longer had, or perhaps could no longer afford, after years of exhausting war. They talked endlessly about the future, about home, about America, about lives that sounded impossibly abundant to British ears, hardened by austerity. He told me about his family's farm in Nebraska. A young woman from Hampshire wrote, "They have 3 cars, 3, and electricity in every room, and a refrigerator as big as a wardrobe." He spoke as if this were perfectly ordinary. To Americans, it was ordinary. They came from a country that had not been bombed, where food was plentiful, lights stayed on at night, and ration books were unknown. The contrast with Britain's wartime austerity was sharp and visible in almost everything the Americans did. Some British civilians welcomed the glimpse of abundance. Others found it offensive. This easy display of wealth while Britain had endured years of sacrifice and loss. Nowhere was resentment stronger than among British soldiers who had been fighting since 1939. These men had survived years of combat, only to come home and find Americans, new to the war, being celebrated as heroes. "We held the line alone for 2 years," one British sergeant said bitterly. Where were they then? Now they arrive with money and chocolate and big talk about winning the war, and everyone treats them like saviors. It wasn't entirely fair, but it was deeply felt. The Americans had entered the war late. That was simply a fact. Britain had stood alone against Hitler from June 1940 to June 1941. It had endured the Blitz, fought in North Africa, the Atlantic, and the Mediterranean, while the United States remained neutral. Gratitude for American involvement was genuine, but so was the frustration at how long it had taken. By early 1944, however, most British civilians had accepted the American presence as unavoidable and necessary. Whatever the personal grievances or cultural clashes, everyone understood why those men were there. The invasion was coming. No one spoke about it openly, but it was impossible to miss. The Americans were gathering in southern England because they were preparing to cross the Channel and fight their way into France. In December 1943, that reality became unavoidable. In the South Hams area of Devon, surrounding Slapton Sands, the British government ordered the evacuation of thousands of civilians. Around 3,000 people were given just weeks to leave their homes, farms, and businesses. The Americans needed the land to rehearse amphibious landings. The beaches closely resembled Normandy. Training had to be as realistic as possible. "They came to our door on December the 4th, one evacuee recalled. They said we had to be out by December 20th. Christmas was coming, and they were telling us to leave our homes." Some families had lived on their land for generations, but this was for the war effort. For the invasion, they were told. The evacuees scattered, staying with relatives, moving into temporary housing, or wherever they could find space. American troops moved into their villages and began practicing for D-Day. In April 1944, disaster struck during Exercise Tiger. German E-boats attacked a training convoy off the Devon coast, killing more than 700 American servicemen. The boat evacuated civilians knew something terrible had happened. They noticed the tightened security, the ambulances, the grim expressions. But the details were classified. By May 1944, southern England had become one vast armed camp. Roads were choked with convoys. Tanks, trucks, and jeeps filled every available space. Landing craft crowded ports and harbors in numbers that could not be hidden. The civilian population watched and waited. "You couldn't miss it," a woman from Portsmouth later said. "Every road, every field, every harbor, the noise never stopped. Engines, shouted orders, metal clanging. We knew they'd be leaving soon. You could feel it." The Americans felt it too. As departure drew closer, the mood shifted. The rowdiness in pubs faded. The jokes sounded forced. American soldiers spent more time writing letters home, long letters, careful letters, just in case. Some gave away possessions they no longer thought they would need. Small gifts for British friends, souvenirs, addresses written on scraps of paper, promises to stay in touch. British civilians who had spent months complaining about the Americans began to feel something else entirely. These loud, generous, sometimes irritating foreigners were about to sail across the Channel and fight a war from which many would not return. Everyone understood that. "I saw them in Weymouth the night before they left," a local shopkeeper remembered. "Just boys, really, most of them barely 20. They were singing, trying to look cheerful, but you could see the fear. They knew what was coming. We all did." On the night of June 5, 1944, the convoys began rolling toward the ports. The sound was enormous, the steady thunder of thousands of vehicles moving through the darkness. British civilians stood in doorways and at windows, watching history pass before them. "The whole street came out," a woman from Southampton wrote. "We just stood there in the dark, watching them go. Some were crying. The soldiers waved, trying to smile. One lad, no more than 19, shouted, "See you later, love," to my daughter. She waved back with tears in her eyes. We never saw him again, never even knew his name. The following morning, June 6th, the BBC announced that the invasion had begun. Allied forces had landed in Normandy. The Americans who had filled British streets for months, who had transformed towns and villages, handed chocolate to children, danced with British girls, argued in pubs, rehearsed landings, and waited, were now fighting and dying on the beaches of France. British civilians listened with a mixture of relief and fear. Relief that the invasion had finally begun, anxiety over what lay ahead, gratitude for the sacrifice, and for some, a quiet guilt over past resentments, complaints about manners, money, and confidence, now directed at men bleeding on Normandy sand. "We called them overpaid and oversexed," one British woman reflected years later. "We complained about their behavior and their success with our girls. But they came here, far from home, to fight a war that wasn't originally theirs. Thousands of them died doing it." She remembered a boy who gave her son chocolate whenever he passed. She thought of all of them, the noise they made, the life they brought, the problems they caused, and then the silence that followed when they were gone. The American presence in Britain did not end with D-Day. Troops continued to arrive. Wounded men returned for treatment. Airfields in East Anglia kept flying missions. But the vast concentration in southern England began to disperse. Streets grew quieter. Pubs emptied. Children found fewer soldiers to beg from. In the South Hams, evacuated families were eventually allowed to return, months later, to villages scarred by training, fields overgrown, homes damaged by neglect and weather. The Americans left behind Nissen huts, shell casings, and the memory of 700 men lost during Exercise Tiger. Elsewhere, they left other traces. British women pregnant with American babies, some abandoned, others waiting for husbands to return, children with American accents, pub owners with full tills or broken furniture, families who had sheltered lonely young men and given them a taste of home, and memories, complicated memories of a complicated time. They were impossible, one British veteran later said. Loud, brash, and far too confident, but brave, generous, and mostly just kids, scared and far from home, trying not to show it. We gave them a hard time. They gave us a hard time back. Somehow we muddled through together. That's what I remember most. Not the fights, but the shared cigarettes, the bad jokes, and the understanding underneath it all. That we were in this together. That, perhaps, is the truest summary of how British civilians felt about the Americans who filled their streets before D-Day. Not just the jokes or the complaints, but the recognition, sometimes reluctant, always real, that these foreigners had come to help finish a war Britain could not win alone. They brought wealth, confidence, cultural shock, and problems. But they also brought hope. Hope that the invasion would succeed. Hope that the war would end. Hope that life might return to something like normal. In the dark spring of 1944, after years of loss and endurance, that hope mattered more than chocolate, cigarettes, or nylon stockings ever could. British civilians watched the Americans fill their streets. What they said was complicated, but what they felt beneath the jokes and frustration was simpler. The tide had turned. The end was coming. And these loud, generous, impossible Americans were going to help them win. On the beaches of Normandy, they did exactly that.